Wind River Canyon, Wyoming. January 1876. Wait inside, Bertram said. Jaw tight, eyes already pointing east. The coach will be here within the hour. Aren't you coming in? Cordelia asked. He picked up her bag and walked away. Her brother never looked back. 2 horses rode into the blizzard. East, not the direction of any sanatorium. She stood alone in the doorway. Wedding dress soaking through, 1 dead foot, no crutch. 240 pounds with nowhere to go. Her hand found her father's knife in her pocket. That knife was the beginning of everything. Stay right here, you need to hear what she did next. The storm hit Wind River Canyon without warning. One moment the sky was flat iron gray. The next, snow came sideways off the peaks, thick and wet, and cold enough to cut. It plastered against everything it touched. The pines along the canyon walls vanished behind white. The road, already nothing more than wheel ruts and good intentions, turned to black mud in under an hour. The Vance family carriage pushed through it anyway. Lacquered black with gilded trim, expensive enough to announce money a full block before it arrived, and heavy enough to sink to the axle in soft ground. 6 matched bays heaved against their traces, hooves sucking at the muck with every step, breath fogging in short, hard bursts. The coachman hunched low on the box, hat brim crushed under the weight of snow. The carriage lanterns swung and guttered. Inside, Cordelia Vance sat with her spine rigid, and her hands pressed flat against the velvet seat. She was 22 years old, and she was wearing a wedding dress. White satin, steel-boned corset, laced from her hips to her sternum until she was compressed into a shape someone else had decided she ought to be. She'd had 1 full breath all day. One that morning, when they pulled the laces taut, and she gasped, and the dressmaker said, "You'll get used to it." She had not gotten used to it. Every inhale since then had been a partial negotiation. Every exhale a small concession. The gown had been chosen for her, cut to a silhouette that bore no resemblance to her actual body. 130 yards of fabric wrapped around 240 pounds of woman, and every yard of it designed to make her look smaller than she was. The result was a lie, and everyone present had known it, and no one had said so. Across the carriage, Bertram Thorne watched the window. He was handsome in the worked-at manner of men who'd spent years cultivating it. Dark wool coat, gold watch chain, a jaw that photographers liked. He'd barely glanced at Cora since they left the Valley Road 3 hours ago. Over the course of the whole journey, east to west, train and road, he had looked at her directly perhaps twice, and both times his gaze had slid off her face toward somewhere more comfortable. She'd told herself it was nerves. Her half-brother Julian sat beside Bertram, younger by 2 years, narrow-shouldered. He had their mother's pale eyes and a talent for looking anywhere except directly at trouble. Neither man had spoken in over an hour. She should have noticed that sooner. The carriage lurched hard into a rut. Cora grabbed the doorstrap and her right foot twisted under her. The bad one. She cut off the sound before it got out. The foot had been wrong since she was 7. A fever burned through her for 3 weeks, and when it broke, it left that foot thinner than the left, the calf barely more than bone and stretched skin, the ankle locked inward at a permanent angle. 4 doctors in Philadelphia had an opinion. 2 in Boston had a different one. None of them had helped. She'd learned to keep the foot tucked back and out of sight. She did that now. "We're stopping," Bertram said. Through the wall of snow, she could make out a dark shape ahead. Low and weathered, boards warped silver gray by hard winters. A sign hung above the door with most of its letters gone. She could read 4 of them. DWOD Deadwood Ridge. An old stage station abandoned when the routes changed. She'd seen it on a surveyor's map once. "Why here?" she asked. "Transfer point." He still wasn't looking at her. "The sanatorium sends its own coach from this station. They have equipment for," he gestured, vaguely, toward her. "For the specialized transfer." Cora said nothing. She'd stopped arguing about the sanatorium. The carriage stopped, the door opened, and cold came in like an open hand. Julian grabbed her arm before she could find her footing. Bertram took the other side, and they pulled her out of the carriage and into the slush. Cold came straight through the satin slippers, instant and total. Her bad foot found no solid ground. She lurched sideways. They caught her and kept walking, steering her toward the station entrance without slowing down. "My crutch," she said. "It's still in the carriage." "We'll bring it," Bertram said. They stopped just outside the station door. Bertram set her travel bag down in the snow. Julian let go of her arm. She grabbed the doorframe hard with both hands. "Wait inside," Bertram said. "The coach will be here within the hour. Aren't you coming in? We need to see to the horses." He picked up her bag again and turned back toward the carriage. Julian was already walking. Neither one glanced back. She watched them from the doorway. She heard their voices, low and fast, not meant to carry. She heard gear being loaded and strapped down, saddle leather working. Then hoofbeats, 2 horses moving east, moving fast. East was not the direction of any sanatorium. She stood in the station doorway on one good foot and one bad one, gripping the doorframe, and let herself understand what was happening. All of it. The whole shape of it. Bertram's careful vagueness these past 2 weeks. Julian unable to hold her eyes for more than a second at a stretch. The doctor who'd signed forms he never bothered to explain. Her mother's will. The clause that required either Cora's signature or confirmed word of her death before the trust funds could release. January. Wyoming. No shelter. No crutch. She tried to breathe. The corset stopped her. Her legs gave out. She went down hard into the snow, the white satin soaking through in an instant, her bad foot folding underneath her. The cold came up through the ground fast, through the dress, through everything. She clawed at the doorframe and couldn't get traction. Her hands were going numb. She was 240 pounds, with a dead right foot and no crutch, down in the snow in a wedding dress, with a blizzard rolling in thicker every minute. She needed air. Her hand found the pocket sewn into the gown. The seamstress had argued against it. Cora had pushed until she won. Her fingers closed around the small folding knife inside. Her father had given it to her when she was 8 years old. He'd died the following winter. She'd carried the knife for 14 years since, in a pocket or a sleeve or tucked inside her boot, because she'd learned early that help was not reliably coming, and she needed to manage what she could manage herself. She got the blade open. She worked the tip into the gap at the front busk between the 2 steel closures and pushed hard, then twisted. The busk cracked, then snapped. The corset split, and air poured in, cold and clean and full, expanding her lungs all the way down in a way they hadn't been allowed to expand all day. She pulled another breath, then another. The gray at the edges of her vision rolled back. She got herself up onto her good knee, then pushed her back against the station wall and got to standing. The corset lay in the snow behind her. Silk and steel and bone, everything they'd built to fold her into the right shape for their purposes. She looked at it for 1 second. Then she dragged herself through the station door. Inside was dark and cold and smelled of rot. A rusted stove stood in one corner. Dead for years, a bench with a cracked leg. 4 walls doing their best to stay upright. No fire, no heat. Snow sifted in through the gaps in the boards and lay in thin lines across the rotten floor, but she was breathing, fully all the way down. Outside, the blizzard thickened across the canyon. The last gray light was going fast. She was alone in the mountains. In January, with nothing but the dress on her back and the knife still open in her hand, she looked around the station. There had to be something in here she could use. She found one thing worth having in the old station. A rusted tin pail sitting upside down in the corner, dry underneath. She righted it and sat on it, and pulled her knees up as far as the ruined satin would allow, and tucked her hands under her arms for warmth. The cold came in through everything. The walls, the floor, the gap under the door. Her slippers were soaked through, and her toes had gone past pain into that flat. Nothing that meant real trouble. She knew enough to know that much. She breathed. Steady, full breaths. for the first time in hours, and she focused on the sound of them in the dark, because it was the only thing she had control of. Outside, the blizzard worked itself into something worse. Wind off the canyon walls made the boards shudder and moan. Snow sifted in through the cracks and fell in thin lines across the rotten floor like white threads. She didn't cry. She thought about it. Her throat went tight, and her eyes burned. But she pressed her back harder against the wall and kept breathing and didn't let it out. Crying cost heat. She needed every degree she had left. She counted what she could manage, one good leg, one working hand, the other going stiff. A folding knife, the dress on her back, which was soaked and therefore worse than useless, the tin pail she was sitting on, 4 walls that were mostly still standing. That was all. She'd been surviving on less than she deserved for years. That fact sat in her chest like a stone. She'd learned to move around it. She was working on her right slipper, trying to peel the wet silk away from her dead foot, when she heard the horse. She heard it before she could see anything. Hooves on frozen ground, heavy and deliberate, not hurrying. A big animal. She pushed herself upright against the wall and got her hand on the door frame. Then she heard the second sound, boots crunching through ice crust, and the station door swung open. He had to duck to get through the frame. He stood there in the doorway with snow, covering his hat and both shoulders, and his eyes scanning the interior fast. They landed on her. She braced herself. The usual things happened when men looked at her for the first time. The slight widening, the reassessment, the arrangement of their face into something polite. He did none of that. He just looked at her the way a surveyor looks at terrain. Assessing, practical. Anyone else in here? He said. No, you alone out here? I am now. He stepped inside and pulled the door to behind him. Snow fell off his shoulders and hat in a sheet. He was tall, with the kind of build that came from actual work, and not the deliberate cultivation of it. Dark hair under the hat brim, a jaw with 2 days of stubble on it. His coat was heavy canvas over wool, worn in, and repaired at the left elbow. He crouched down in front of her without asking permission and took hold of her right hand, turned it over, pressed 2 fingers to the back of it, then the wrist. How long have you been in here, he said. An hour, maybe more. Fingers. She spread them. He looked at the color, pressed each one. Toes? I can't feel them. He looked at the satin slippers, soaked black with snowmelt. He looked at the ruined dress. He looked at the broken corset lying in the snow outside, visible through the gap under the door. Can you walk? He said. Not without support. My right foot doesn't. She stopped. No, he stood. I've got a pack horse outside. She's steady. I'll get you up. My trunk is in the carriage, she said. It's somewhere back on the road. They left it. What's in it? She thought about it honestly. Silk gowns, satin shoes, a cashmere shawl, a silver hand mirror. Nothing that would keep a person alive in a Wyoming winter. Nothing useful, she said. Then we leave it. He didn't ask another question about it. He came around to her left side, got her arm across his shoulders, and lifted. Not the sudden graceless jerk of a man, surprised by the weight. He lifted steadily, compensating as he went, the way you'd lift a full water barrel if you'd done it before and knew how to use your legs. She came upright, and he kept her there, balanced, and moved her toward the door. My name is Gideon Mercer, he said, while they crossed the floor. I run a trap line out of Wind River Canyon. Cabins 4 miles north. Cordelia Vance, she said. Outside, the cold hit her face like a thrown bucket of water. The horse stood at the hitching post, a big gray Percheron with a wide back and snow frosted along her mane. She turned her head to look at them and didn't move. Gideon got Cora to the horse's left side. She looked at the stirrup, even on her best day, with 2 good feet and nothing wrong with her, mounting a horse in a soaked satin gown with steel boning digging into her hips would have been a significant project. I can't, she started. You don't have to. He laced his hands together at knee height and looked at her. Left foot in my hands. Push up. I'll do the rest. I know what you weigh, he said. I've loaded pack horses for 12 years. Left foot. She put her foot in his hands. He pushed, and she grabbed the saddle horn, and somehow her right leg swung over and she was up. The horse shifted, adjusted, and settled. Gideon swung up behind her and reached around to take the reins, and they moved out into the white. He said nothing for the first quarter mile. The wind was at their backs. She concentrated on keeping her spine straight and her weight centered. Her feet were 2 blocks of ice. "Who left you there?" he said. "My fiancé," she said. "And my brother." He didn't say anything to that. "There's supposed to be a sanatorium," she said. "He told me there was a transfer coach. He said the sanatorium had specialists." She heard herself saying it and heard how it sounded. She stopped. "There's no sanatorium in Wind River Canyon," Gideon said. She knew that now. The 4 miles felt longer. Snow came in sideways at times, and he turned the horse's nose into it until it passed, then turned back north. She could feel the warmth of him at her back, and it was the only warm thing left in the world. She held the saddle horn and kept breathing, and didn't let herself think ahead more than 10 minutes. The cabin appeared between the pines like it had grown there. 1-story log construction, chinked with clay, a stone chimney already sending a thread of gray smoke up into the storm. A small barn attached at the south end. A woodpile under an overhang that was stacked 6 feet high and looked like it had been split with religious dedication. He helped her down the same way, controlled no sudden movements, got her inside while he still had daylight. Inside, it was warm. Not the desperate, frantic warmth of a fire you'd just built, but the stored warmth of a place that had been well heated for days. A fieldstone fireplace on the east wall with a good, steady fire going. A cast-iron stove beside it. A plank table, 2 chairs. A bunk against the north wall. Tools hanging from every available beam. Leather hides stacked and drying along the walls, metal hardware sorted into clay jars on 2 long shelves. It smelled like pine smoke and lanolin and iron. She made it 2 steps inside, and then her good leg went out. She got hold of the table edge and slid down against it and sat on the floor. She didn't try to get up. Gideon came in behind her, shutting the door, shaking snow from his coat. He saw her on the floor and went directly to the stove. He had a pot of broth heating inside of 3 minutes. Then he came to where she was sitting and crouched down. "I'm going to cut your boots off," he said. "The silk is freezing against your skin. It'll do more damage if it stays on." He'd said your boots as though both of them counted. He pulled a knife from his belt, short, wide blade, well maintained. He worked the tip under the edge of the left slipper and cut carefully down the back seam and peeled it off. Her foot was red, then white in patches. He pressed his thumb against the arch. "Hurts?" he said. "Yes." "Good," he said. "Pain means blood is moving." He worked the right slipper off more slowly. The foot was thinner there, the silk plastered against bone and sparse muscle and the inward-turned ankle. He didn't pause or change his expression. He peeled the silk clear and set the slipper aside and looked at the foot as though it were a problem to be measured and solved. He got a basin of warm water from the stove and set it on the floor and put both her feet into it. The return of sensation to the left foot was unpleasant but manageable. The right foot was different. There was some sensation, but it was patchy and unreliable, and the ankle didn't move when she tried it. She stared at it. Then she started crying. She hadn't cried in the station. She'd kept it locked up through the whole ride. But sitting on the floor of a strange man's cabin, looking at her dead foot and her ruined dress, and thinking about the 4 miles of wilderness between her and nowhere, it came out. She didn't make much noise. She pressed her hand over her mouth and cried. Anyway, Gideon set a tin cup of broth in front of her. He sat on the floor beside her, back against the table leg, and said nothing for a minute. Then he said, "Drink that." She drank it, both hands around the cup, warm all the way down. "I'm sorry," she said when she could. "I can't stop. I don't normally." "You got left in a blizzard, in a wedding dress," he said. "Seems reasonable." She laughed. It surprised her so much she almost choked on the broth. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. He refilled the cup. She looked at her foot again. The calf above it, thin where the left was round, the muscle mostly gone, the skin loose over the bone. It's been like this since I was 7, she said. It got worse. Every year they kept me inside. They said walking on it would damage it. They said if I didn't keep still and keep off it, it would get worse. She paused. So I kept still. I kept off it. And I ate because there was nothing else to do and I was lonely. She shook her head. Now I'm this enormous thing that can't walk without a crutch and can't stand on her own and breaks chairs and takes up too much space in carriages and had to be disposed of in the middle of winter because I'm too much trouble to. Stop, Gideon said. She stopped. He was looking at her straight on. The Wyoming wilderness doesn't give a damn if you weigh 100 pounds or 250 pounds, he said. Cold snow swallows the skinny and the fat all the same if they give up. You're heavy and your leg is weak. That's a fact. He paused. But if you treat your own body like a death sentence, you'll die long before the spring thaw. She looked at him. He wasn't being kind. His voice was flat and level, the voice of a man stating terrain conditions. But his eyes were steady on her, and there was no cruelty in them, no impatience. Just the particular honesty of someone who had no reason to lie. She pulled in a slow breath. All right, she said. He nodded. He got up and took his sheepskin coat from the peg by the door. It was enormous. Cream-colored, worn soft, sheepskin on the inside and out. He dropped it over her shoulders. It covered her to the knee and past her elbows and weighed more than her own arms did. Her body went still inside it, just still, like everything that had been braced and coiled and contracted. For the past 12 hours, finally found nothing to fight against. She sat on the floor of Gideon Mercer's cabin with her feet in warm water and his coat around her shoulders and the fire at her left side, and she let herself be warm. She didn't ask him yet why he'd been on that road in that blizzard. There was time for that later. For now, she breathed. Long and full and unobstructed. That was enough. She slept on the bunk that night, wrapped in 2 wool blankets and the sheepskin coat, and didn't wake until the light through the single window was fully white. Day. Late morning, maybe. The fire was fresh. She hadn't heard him build it. Gideon was at the workbench across the room, running a spokeshave along a leather strap with long, even strokes. He glanced over when she stirred. Broth on the stove, he said. She sat up carefully. The dress had dried overnight into something stiff and strange around her. She looked down at herself. White satin turned gray at the hems. The skirt creased into shapes it would never give up. A wedding dress that had never made it to a wedding. She stood up from the bunk, found her balance, and started toward the stove, using the wall as her guide. In the daylight, she could see the cabin more clearly. It was better organized than it had appeared last night. Everything had a place and was in it. The leather hides hung in a specific order by type. The tools on the beams were arranged by use. The shelves held not just metal hardware but books. 3 of them, a surveyor's manual, a medical reference, and something on applied mechanics worn to near illegibility at the spine. The bunk she'd slept in was built into the wall, solid as furniture, with a folded second blanket at the foot. The man lived here the way a good craftsman kept his shop. Nothing wasted, nothing unnecessary. She reached the table. There were 2 chairs. She'd noticed them last night. The one on the near side was facing her, and she lowered herself into it with both hands on the seat edge, distributing her weight across both legs and both arms, the way she'd learned to do over years of uncertain furniture. The chair held for 2 seconds. Then the left front leg cracked and the whole thing tipped and she went sideways into the floor. She hit hard. Left shoulder, left hip. The chair broke beneath her and scattered across the planks. Silence. She lay there in the wreckage of it for a moment, looked at the ceiling, felt the familiar heat rise up her throat and into her face. The heat that came before the worst of it. The shame that was so total and so specific, it had its own geography inside her chest, its own rooms she knew the layout of by heart. She got herself onto her hands and knees. She was shaking. "Throw me out," she said. Gideon had set down the leather strap. He was watching her from the workbench. Just throw me back out into the snow, she said. I'll break every stick of furniture you own. I can't sit in a normal chair. I can't walk without falling. I'm too heavy for your horse to carry comfortably, and I'm too large for your bunk, and I broke your chair in less than 24 hours. Just throw me out. It would be simpler. He said nothing. She picked up a piece of the broken chair leg and set it aside. She was trying to find the floor with her good foot so she could push herself up. You done? He said. She looked up. With the speech, he said, she pressed her lips together. He came across the room and helped her up from the floor, got her settled against the table edge so she had something to hold. Then he picked up both pieces of the broken chair and looked at the joint where the leg had split. Poor construction to begin with, he said. Single peg, no glue. That chair would have failed under me, and I don't weigh what you do. He set the pieces on his workbench. Sit on the stool. There was a low stool by the stove, three-legged stout. She made her way to it and sat. It held without complaint. Gideon went out the back door. She heard him in the woodshed, chopping. Then the sound of a hammer and a handsaw working, not frantic, just steady and purposeful. She drank her broth and watched the fire and said nothing. He came back in with a short, wide plank under one arm and a second thick section of oak in his other hand. He set them on the workbench and got to work. She watched him. He wasn't making the stool taller. He was making something new. 2 wide legs instead of 4 narrow ones, each leg a full 1.5 inches of solid oak, notched together at the seat, and pegged with hardwood pins and glued at every joint. The seat itself was 3 inches thick, wide enough to be stable. He cut a slight curve into the frontage of the seat so it wouldn't cut into the backs of the thighs. He was building it for her measurements without measuring her, watching her as he worked, looking at her frame, her height, the width of her hips, the set of her shoulders, and building to fit what he actually saw. She'd never had anything built to fit what people actually saw when they looked at her. An hour later, he set it down in front of her. Try it, he said. She stood up from the stool, moved to the new seat, and sat, both legs solid under her. The seat wide enough, the curve at the front exactly right. She shifted her weight left, then right. It didn't so much as creak. She sat there for a moment with both feet flat on the floor. Thank you, she said. It came out quiet. He was already back at the workbench. He picked up the leather measuring tape from the hook above the bench. I need to look at your leg, he said. Why? Because a bad brace will do more damage than no brace. And whatever they put on you before was built for someone half your size. He looked at her. I need your actual measurements. Not the ones some city doctor imagined. She hesitated. Her right leg was not something she showed people, not voluntarily. The foot was bad enough. The calf above it was worse, thin and pale and strange against the round of her left leg, the ankle crooked inward, the whole limb somehow both too small and too visible. He waited, no impatience. She reached down and pulled the hem of the ruined dress up above her right knee. He crouched in front of her with the measuring tape. He worked methodically. The circumference at the calf, the circumference at the ankle, the distance from the back of the knee to the floor, the angle of the ankle joint, which he measured by pressing 2 fingers against the bone and finding the natural resting position without forcing it. He wrote each number on a piece of brown paper with a charcoal stick. Then he sat back on his heels and studied the leg for a long moment. What do you see? She said. She didn't mean it to come out sharp. It came out sharp anyway. He looked up. Those city doctors were idiots, he said. They were trying to starve you so you'd fit their tiny iron cages. He looked back at the leg. A bigger frame means thicker bones. Your left thigh muscle is twice as strong as an average woman's. I can see that just from watching you stand. You've been compensating for that foot for 15 years, and you built real muscle doing it, even kept inside. He stood up. You aren't weak, Cora. You just need a brace built for your actual weight. She didn't speak. He went to the back corner of the cabin where 3 large pieces of bull hide were hanging, stiff and dark, untanned on the flesh side. He pulled the largest one down and dropped it on the workbench and began cutting. She watched him work for a while, without speaking. "You've made braces before?" she said. "Not for a person," he said. "For horses. And once for a dog that got a leg caught in a trap." He held a curved piece of hide up to the light and looked through it. "The principle is the same. You need to support the joint, not immobilize it. City braces immobilize. They stop movement because the doctors don't trust the patient to manage it. But the joint needs movement, or the muscle that's left will atrophy further." He said this matter-of-factly, as though it were obvious, as though no one should need 15 years to figure it out. She thought about the iron brace she'd worn at 13, bolted at the ankle, rigid from heel to knee. It had cut into her calf every time she tried to walk, and she'd bled through her stocking twice before they took it off and put her back to bed and told her she'd been misusing it. "The iron ones cut into me," she said, "because they weren't shaped to your leg," he said. "A brace is only as good as its fit. If it doesn't match what's actually there, it works against you instead of with you." He took a medium-sized clay pot from the stove and put the cut pieces of hide into it with water and set it over the low heat. While they soaked, he went to a wooden crate under the workbench and dug through it, moving things aside with purpose. He came out with 4 steel springs, coiled and heavy, the kind used in wolf traps. He set them on the workbench and looked at them, and then looked at his measurements, and began bending 2 of them into a gentle curve with a pair of long-nosed pliers. "Why springs?" she said. "Rigid support pushes back against your weight," he said. "That means every step is a fight. But if there's flex in the brace, the spring absorbs the force and redirects it." He held one curved spring up and demonstrated with his thumb, pressing it. It gives slightly and then rebounds. So when your foot comes down and your body weight follows, the spring catches that weight and helps push you back up. Instead of fighting your body, it works with it. He said it plainly, without flourish. A man explaining a practical problem and its practical solution. She thought about this. Her body weight, all 240 pounds of it, pressing down through her heel with every step. Every brace she'd worn had fought that weight, dug in against it, bruised her from the inside out. He was describing a brace that would catch her instead. The hide came out of the pot, darkened and pliable. He shaped it on a wooden form. He carved quickly from a scrap block, pressing the warm leather around the curves of the form until it held the shape he wanted. Then he worked the springs into channels he'd cut along the back and sides, stitching them in with heavy waxed thread, the needle driving through the thick hide with a mallet behind it. He checked his measurements 3 more times while he worked. Every time he looked up to compare the dimensions on the paper against the actual leg, he looked at her leg directly, adjusting his work to match the real thing and not the imagined thing. By late afternoon, it was done. He brought it to where she sat and crouched down again. "I'm going to fit it," he said. "Tell me if it's tight anywhere." He eased the brace around her calf. The inside was smooth, no rough edges. The bull hide had dried to the exact curve of the form, which was close enough to her own shape that it settled in around her leg without gaps or pressure points. He positioned the springs along the back of the calf and the outside of the ankle. Then he brought the lacing up the front, not pulled tight but snugged, and tied it at the top. "Stand up," he said. She stood. She felt her weight go down through the brace and into the floor, and the springs compressed slightly and then pressed back, and her body found a line it hadn't found in 15 years. Straight, upright. Both feet under her, both taking weight. She took one step, then another. She crossed from the workbench to the fireplace and back. 8 steps. No pain, no catching, no twist at the ankle that sent her sideways. She stopped in the middle of the room and stood there. Gideon was watching her from the workbench with his arms crossed and his charcoal stick still in his hand. She looked down at the brace, dark bull hide, carefully shaped, the steel springs just visible at the edges, built for her actual body, her actual weight, her actual foot. "It doesn't cut," she said. "No," he said. "It shouldn't." She took another step, then turned, then walked back across the room to the window, and looked out at the snow and the pines and the last orange light going down behind the canyon wall, on both feet. She stood on both feet and looked out at the world, and breathed behind her. Gideon went back to work. The next morning, Cora put the brace on herself. She sat on the edge of the bunk and worked through it step by step. Positioned the lower cradle around her ankle first. Brought the curved hull of bull hide up along her calf. Laced the front, not too tight, snugged like Gideon had shown her. She tied it off and stood up and walked to the stove without touching the wall. Gideon was outside splitting wood. She could hear the axe. She stood at the stove and made coffee from the tin of grounds on the shelf and listened to the rhythm of it. The solid crack on the downswing, the pause, another crack. She counted the pace of it, even unhurried, efficient. The axe didn't come down again until the first piece had been kicked clear of the block. She brought 2 cups outside. He was at the far edge of the woodyard, 30 yards from the cabin. A round of pine balanced on the splitting block in front of him, already scored with the hatchet. He swung once, clean, and the round fell apart into 2 halves. He looked up when she came across the snow toward him. She was moving carefully. The ground was uneven, and the snow hid the bad patches. But the brace held at the ankle every time she hit a soft spot, caught and steadied, and she made it across without going down. She held out the cup. He took it. "I want to learn to do that," she said. Looking at the block, he drank his coffee. Looked at the axe. Looked at her. "You ever split wood before?" he said. "No, it's mostly legs," he said. "People think it's arms. It isn't. The arms guide it. The legs and the hips drive it." He handed the cup back. "Go ahead and try." She set both cups down in the snow. He handed her the axe. It was heavier than she expected. The handle was long, smooth-worn hickory, and the head was a full-size maul, not one of the small camp axes she'd seen in illustrations. She looked at the half-round on the block. "Where do I aim?" she said. "At the grain. Follow the line that's already in the wood, don't fight it, and stand wider than you think you need to." She set her feet, left foot forward, right foot back, wider than felt natural. She raised the axe above her head, arms straight, and brought it down. It glanced off the left side of the half-round and buried itself in the snow. She pulled it out. "Reset. You're lifting with your shoulders," Gideon said. He was behind her and to the left drinking his coffee. "Let the axe do the work on the way down. You just bring it up and aim it. Your weight does the rest." She thought about that. Her weight, 240 pounds of it, poised at the top of the swing, following gravity down. She raised the axe again. This time, when it started down, she stopped fighting it, stopped trying to add her own force to it, and just let it fall along the line she'd aimed it at. The half-round split clean to the block. The shock of it went up through her hands and arms, and she laughed out loud. It surprised her. The sound of it in the cold, pine-scented air surprised her. "Again," Gideon said. She split 6 more pieces before her arms complained. Stopped, breathed, stood the axe head down in the snow. Gideon picked up the split pieces and stacked them under the overhang without comment, not praising her like a child, not making the moment larger than it was, just continuing on, expecting her to continue on with him. She picked up the axe again. By the end of the morning, she'd split a full cord. That afternoon, he showed her the leather press. It sat at the center of the workshop end of the cabin, a heavy iron-framed machine bolted to a plank table, used to compress hides for saddlery work. The lever arm was 4 feet long. The plate that pressed down was 12 inches square and weighed as much as a bag of flour. "The lever multiplies the force you put in," he said, setting a double thickness of bull hide under the plate. "The longer the arm, the less effort it takes at the handle to produce pressure at the plate. It's called mechanical advantage." "I know what a lever is," she said. "Good." He stepped back. "Then you know that a heavier person standing at the end of that arm produces more downward force than a lighter one, without working any harder." She looked at the lever, looked at the hide under the plate. She took hold of the handle and pushed down. The plate descended slowly, compressed the hide, and held it flat. She could feel the pressure through her hands and down into her feet. The brace at her right ankle, taking the load and sending it straight down into the ground. More, Gideon said. She leaned into it. Her body weight came forward and down, and the press drove deeper, and the hide compressed further than she'd seen Gideon get it in 2 attempts. He made a mark on the pressure gauge with his charcoal stick. "That's the deepest cut I've gotten off that press since I built it," he said. She straightened up. He was looking at her with something she didn't have a word for right away. Not surprise. Something past surprise. Something that had settled into respect. He turned back to the workbench and picked up his tools. She pulled the hide from the press and set it on the drying rack. January turned into February. February turned into something slightly less brutal. The storms still came down off the peaks every few days and pinned them inside for a day or two at a stretch. But in between, the light was there, low and white and clean, and she spent every available hour outside. She split wood. She hauled water from the creek. She learned to snowshoe in flat terrain, and then on the gentle slopes behind the cabin, using her poles and her body weight to manage the grade. She came in every evening with her cheeks burned red by the wind, and her lungs full, and her legs tired in the good solid way that meant they'd been used. Her body didn't change its fundamental shape. She remained a large woman. Wide shoulders, full arms, heavy thighs, the soft round of her belly and hips unchanged under the wool shirt and canvas trousers. Gideon had traded from town before the worst of winter locked the roads. She'd stopped waiting to be smaller before she was allowed to do things. She just did them. What did change was the muscle under the softness. She could feel it now when she carried a water barrel, the way her back engaged, the way her thighs took the weight and held it. She could feel it when she brought the axe down and the split wood flew apart. Her right leg, the withered one, had begun to show just a small increase in the calf where it had been slack and thin before. The daily motion, the daily load-bearing, was asking something of that muscle, and the muscle was answering slowly, building back what 15 years of forced rest had taken. Inside the cabin, she found her way to the leatherwork. It started because she was idle on a storm day and picked up a scrap of hide and a stitching needle and tried to close a split seam she'd seen Gideon set aside. He watched her from across the room for a while without saying anything. When she finished, he came over and looked at it. "Too tight at the top," he said. "You want even tension all the way through, or the seam will pucker under load." He showed her with his own hands. Like this. She practiced it on another scrap, then on a full seam. By the third try, her stitches were consistent and tight and even. Gideon handed her a saddle panel that needed a repair on the lacing channel. She worked on it for 2 hours and gave it back to him. He ran his thumb along the seam, checked the tension, and set it on the finished pile. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. After that, she worked on something every storm day. He left pieces for her on the corner of the workbench, not the simple repairs, but the moderately complex ones, the lacing channels and the D-ring attachments. She found she liked the focus of it, liked the way the needle moved through the hide in a predictable and controllable line, liked the physical resistance of the material under her hands. It was honest work. The seam either held or it didn't. There was no ambiguity. She also found the ledger books, 2 of them, brown-covered, stacked under the workbench. She pulled them out on a slow evening and opened the first one and spent 20 minutes working out the accounting system Gideon was using, which was functional, but harder to follow than it needed to be. "Your accounts are correct," she said, "but you're tracking costs and revenues in the same column. If you split them, you'll be able to see your margin on each job at a glance instead of doing the subtraction every time." He looked up from the bridle he was working. "My father was a banker," she said. "I used to sit with his bookkeeper on rainy afternoons. I was 9. He taught me double entry." Gideon set down the bridle and came to look at what she was pointing at. She walked him through it. He followed without comment, asking 2 questions, both of them sharp and practical. Then he handed her the second ledger and a fresh stick of charcoal and went back to his bridle. She set up the new system that night and transferred 6 months of records into it by morning. He found it on the table and read through it over breakfast. "What's my margin on the pack saddle order from Fort Washakie?" he said. 31%, she said, after hide cost and labor time. "And the harness repair work?" 12%. "You're undercharging on repairs." He turned the ledger page and read further. She watched him without appearing to watch him. He had a focused stillness when he was reading. The same stillness he had when he was cutting a hide to a pattern. The full attention of a person who took the thing in front of them seriously. He set the ledger down and looked across the table at her. Not the way she was used to being looked at, which was across and down and slightly past, the gaze of a person managing a problem. He looked at her directly, the way he looked at a piece of work he respected. She looked back. "You should charge more for repairs," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll adjust the rate in spring." He picked up his coffee and went back to the workbench. She opened the ledger and made a note in the margin about the repair rate and what it ought to be. Outside the canyon, February went on being cold and dark and difficult. Inside the cabin, something warm and steady built between them, the way a good fire builds. Not fast, not announced. It just grew, from layer to layer, until one evening she looked up from the leather seam she was finishing and found him already watching her from across the room. She didn't look away. He didn't either, he said. "Your stitching on the cantle panel is better than mine," she said. "I have smaller hands," he said. "That's not why." She looked back down at the seam. Her face was warm. He went back to work. Neither of them said anything else. But the thing was there, between the two of them, in the warm-lit cabin, with the snow coming down outside, and the fire, steady in the stone fireplace. It was there, and they both knew it, and neither of them made anything of it. Yet, the winter was still long. There was time. January came back. That was how it felt. The middle of February and a cold front dropped off the peaks in the night, and by morning the temperature was what it had been in the first week of the year. The creek froze over again. Ice formed on the inside of the window glass, and she scraped it off with a knife each morning. Gideon had a trap line that ran northeast along the canyon wall, 14 sets over roughly 6 miles of terrain. He checked it every 3 days. He left at first light and was usually back by mid-afternoon. On the third Tuesday of February, he wasn't back by mid-afternoon. Cora noticed it the way she noticed most things, slowly at first and then all at once. 4 o'clock and the light going fast. Then 5, and the light gone entirely, and nothing but darkness and pine, and the far-off sound of wind through the canyon. She built the fire up and put water on to heat and told herself it was nothing. He'd gone further on the line, stopped to reset a spring. Trails were iced over. At 6 she put on both coats and went to the barn and checked that his horse was still gone. Still gone. She came back inside and stood at the window and looked at the dark. At 6:30 she heard it. Not hoofbeats, something lower. A sound at the edge of the tree line, at the limit of what the cabin light reached, and she couldn't identify it at first. Then she could. Footsteps, one at a time. Slow and uneven, with long pauses between. She grabbed the lantern and went out. He was 30 yards into the trees, moving toward the cabin on foot. The horse was gone. His left arm was across his chest, and his right hand was pressed to his side, and she could see the dark stain on his coat from 20 feet away, already black in the lantern light. Gideon. She got to him and took his right arm over her shoulder. He was heavy and only partly upright, and he leaned into her without speaking. She took his weight, all of it, or near to it, settling across her shoulders, and down through her spine and into the brace at her right ankle, which held. "Grizzly," he said. His voice was wrong, too thin. "Don't talk," she said. She got them moving. 30 yards to the cabin door, and it felt like 100. He was losing coordination fast, His legs were moving, but not reliably, and twice she had to brace and stop and redistribute his weight before they could continue. She used the terrain, found the firm ground under the snow by memory of where she'd walked it 100 times before, and she kept moving. At the cabin door, she got it open with one hand while holding him with the other, walked him through, and got him to the bunk. He went down onto it sideways, and she turned him onto his back. She pulled the coat off him. The left side of his shirt was soaked through. She cut it open with his knife, the short-bladed one from the workbench, and looked at what was underneath. 3 deep lacerations down the left side of his chest and ribs, starting at the shoulder and running to just below the last rib. Ragged-edged, the way claw wounds were. 2 of them were still bleeding freely. The third was deeper and had slowed, which was both better and worse. She pressed both hands flat against the wound and held pressure. She looked around the cabin from where she was, cataloging what was reachable. Clean cloth, thread, needle, alcohol. She needed alcohol to clean the wounds. She knew he had a bottle of grain alcohol on the back shelf, used for treating infected trap wounds on animals. She kept pressure with her left hand and reached his coat with her right and pulled it across the bunk toward her, going for the inside breast pocket, where she'd seen him keep his kit. The pocket held 2 things, a small roll of bandage cloth and a folded piece of paper. She set the bandage on the bunk and started to put the paper back. Then she saw the name on the outside, written in a hand she recognized. She'd seen it on dozens of legal documents and letters in the Vance household. Precise, upright, with the same distinctive loop on the capital B. Bertram Thorne. She unfolded it. It was 2 pages. The first was a deposit slip, a bank draft from the First Commercial Bank of Philadelphia dated November 14th, made out to Gideon Mercer. The amount was $40. In the notation line, in Bertram's handwriting, it read, Transport and Isolation, D.W. Ridge, female subject. Heavy, disabled. The second page was a hand-drawn map. Deadwood Ridge was marked with an X. The abandoned stage station was labeled in Bertram's hand, and below it, a written instruction, subject to be delivered to remote cabin location, and held through winter months. No return contact. She looked at both pages for a long moment. Gideon made a sound on the bunk. His breathing had changed, gone shorter and faster. She folded the pages, set them on the shelf above the bunk, and pressed both hands back onto the wound and held the pressure until the bleeding slowed enough to work. Then she went to the workbench. She knew where everything was. She'd organized the shelf above it 2 weeks ago. She found the grain alcohol, the heavy leather needles, and the waxed thread. She found the clean hide strips they used for wound packing. She brought all of it to the bunk and set it out in order. She cleaned the wounds with the alcohol. He came half-conscious when it hit, and she held his shoulder flat against the bunk with one hand until he went still again. She threaded the heaviest needle, the same needles she'd been using on saddle seams for 6 weeks. She closed the 2 open lacerations, 8 stitches on the first, 11 on the second. She kept her stitches even and tight, and she didn't rush. Her hands were steady. She didn't let them be anything else. When it was done, she packed the 3rd wound, the deepest one, with clean cloth strips, and bound his chest with the bandage roll and pulled the wool blankets over him. His forehead was burning. She got fresh water from the bucket and a clean cloth and laid it across his forehead and sat on the stool beside the bunk and watched his breathing level out into something more regular. The fire was low. She built it back up. She sat down again. On the shelf above the bunk, Bertram's 2 pages sat folded where she'd left them. She looked at Gideon's face. Slack with unconsciousness now, the fever doing its work. The long jaw with the stubble grown in past 2 days, the strong hands resting open at his sides. The left one crusted with dried blood at the knuckles where he must have fought the animal off. He'd walked 6 miles back from that trap line with 3 claw wounds in his side. She picked up the 2 pages and looked at them again in the firelight. Read the notation. Transport and isolation. Female subject. Heavy, disabled. She looked at the date, November 14th, 6 weeks before he'd found her at Deadwood Ridge. He'd taken the job. He'd known who she was. He'd known why she was there. She sat with that. Outside, the wind moved through the canyon and the fire shifted, and the cabin settled around them both. Gideon's breathing was still too fast, but it was even, which was something. She set the papers back on the shelf. She wrung out the cloth and laid it fresh across his forehead, and didn't look at his face, because if she looked at his face right now, she would think about the $40, and the notation, and the map, and she would stop being able to think at all. So she looked at the fire instead, and kept the cloth cool, and watched him breathe, and waited for morning. The fever broke sometime before dawn. She heard the change in his breathing before she saw it. The short, fast rhythm, smoothed out, slowed, settled into something longer and more regular. She'd been sitting on the stool for 5 hours with a damp cloth in her hand, and the fire at her back, and Bertram's folded papers on the shelf above her head. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. Still warm. But the burning was gone. The desperate furnace heat that had been pouring off him all night had dropped to something manageable. She sat back. He was quiet for another hour. She built the fire up again and made coffee and stood at the window and watched the canyon go from black to gray to the flat, pale blue of very early morning. A light snow was falling, not the driving kind, just the slow, purposeless kind that came down more like settling than like weather. She heard him move behind her. She turned around. His eyes were open. He was looking at the ceiling with the flat, exhausted look of a man taking inventory of where he was and what had happened to him. Then his eyes moved to her. "You stitched me," he said. "Yes." "How many?" 19 total. 8 on the first laceration, 11 on the third one I packed. It was too deep to close cleanly. He processed it. That looked at the ceiling again. "I passed out," he said. "You walked 6 miles first." "The horse spooked when it came out of the brush," he said. "Couldn't catch her." He stopped, breathed. The breathing was careful. The ribs were taped tight, and she could see him adjusting to the limits of it. "She'll come back to the barn on her own. She knows the way." "I know," Cora said. "I'll check for her this morning." He was quiet for a moment. She went to the stove and ladled broth into a cup and brought it to him, and helped him sit up enough to drink it. He winced when the ribs moved, but didn't make a sound. He drank half the cup and held it in both hands, and looked at her. "There's something you want to say to me," he said. She picked up the 2 folded pages from the shelf and set them on the bunk beside him. She didn't hand them to him directly. She set them where he could see them and stepped back. He looked down at them, didn't touch them for a moment. Then he picked them up and unfolded them and read them both, though she was certain he didn't need to. He knew what was on them. He set them down on his chest and looked at her. "I took the job in November," he said. "The contact came through a man in Lander who runs freight arrangements. $40 to collect a woman from Deadwood Ridge and keep her at a remote location through winter." He paused. "I needed the money. I'd put everything I had into the leather press and 3 new hide orders, and I was short on the Fort Washakie saddle contract by February. $40 would have covered the gap." She said nothing. She was watching his face. "I didn't know all of it," he said. "I knew there was a woman being moved for medical reasons. I didn't know she was being moved to die." His jaw tightened. "I rode to Deadwood Ridge to make the collection. I got there 20 minutes after they did." "You saw them leave," she said. "I saw him drag you out of that carriage in a wedding dress and drop you in the slush and drive off." He looked at her steadily. No transfer coach, no medical equipment, no second party waiting. Just a woman in a corset that was stopping her breathing, in a blizzard at a station that's been abandoned for 8 years. He stopped. "I went after him," Gideon said. "Caught up to him a 1/4 mile east. Told him the deal was off. He offered me double. I told him to keep it and turn back." She looked at him for a long time. The fire was burning well behind her. The early morning light was coming in stronger now through the window glass. "Why?" she said. "Because there's a line." he said, between hard work and what that was. And I knew where it was. She pulled in a breath. You should have told me, she said, from the beginning. Yes, he said. I should have. He didn't qualify it, didn't explain it further or stack reasons on top of it. Just said yes and held her gaze. She looked at the papers on his chest. She'd read them maybe a dozen times through the night. Transport and isolation. Female subject. Heavy disabled. $40. She thought about November 14th. 2 months before she'd been put in that carriage, her whole situation had already been arranged and priced and contracted. She'd been sitting in her mother's house in Philadelphia thinking about the wedding and what it meant. And somewhere out here, a man had been hired to receive her at the end of it. She picked up the papers and folded them and put them in the pocket of her canvas trousers. I'll keep these, she said. You should, he said. She sat down on the stool. She looked at her hands in her lap. They were different from the hands she'd had in January. The skin at the base of her fingers had hardened into callus from the axe handle and the stitching needle. Her palms were wider looking somehow, more substantial, like they belonged to a person who did things. Last night, Gideon said. She looked up. When I came out of the trees, he said. You came out with the lantern. You took my weight and you walked me 30 yards over iced ground in the dark. He stopped, looked at her hands, then up at her face. I want to say something to you. All right. He reached out with his right hand, the less damaged one, and took her left hand. He held it palm up in his and looked at it. The calluses, the rough skin at the knuckles, the blunt, capable fingers. They called you a useless, fat cripple so they could throw you away, he said. But look at you. Last night, this body, these hands, and this leg saved my life. He looked up from her hand to her eyes. Your worth is priceless, Cora. You are the strongest woman I've ever met. She didn't look away. She'd been given compliments before. Managed ones, the kind delivered to smooth a transaction. Her mother's friends telling her she had a lovely face as a way of not mentioning the rest of her. Bertram telling her she was charming in the same tone men used when they meant tolerable. This was not that. He was looking at her the way he looked at a finished saddle, at the work itself, at what it had taken to make it, at the integrity of the seams. He was looking at what was actually there. She turned her hand over in his and held it. You took the job, she said, and then you didn't do it. And then you spent 3 months building me a brace and teaching me to split wood and letting me fix your books. Yes, he said. Your actions are a longer record than one decision in November, she said. That's a generous way to look at it. It's an accurate way to look at it, she said. I've had enough people tell me who I was supposed to be. I'd rather look at what people do. He held her hand for another moment. Then he moved to sit up, and she helped him, got his back against the wall and the pillow behind him. And he let himself be helped without arguing about it, which was its own form of trust. She refilled the broth cup and sat on the edge of the bunk, and they were quiet together for a while. Snow was still coming down outside, slow and pale. The horse appeared at the barn door around 8 in the morning, back on her own, as Gideon had said she would. And Cora went out and led her inside and rubbed her down and gave her grain. When she came back in, Gideon was looking at her from the bunk. She came to him and he reached for her, and she sat beside him on the bunk's edge, and he put his good arm around her, and she put her head against his shoulder, careful of his ribs. His hand came up and rested at the back of her neck, warm and steady and without any hesitation at all. Outside the snow fell and the pines held still and the canyon was quiet. She was a large woman with a withered foot and calluses on her palms and a knife she'd been carrying since she was 8 years old, sitting in a log cabin in the Wind River range of Wyoming in the middle of February with her head on the shoulder of a man who'd looked at her body not as a problem to be solved or a liability to be managed, but as proof of what she was capable of. She put her hand flat against his chest, just below the bandaging, and felt his heartbeat under her palm. Steady, strong, present. She stayed. Right there, April arrived like someone had quietly opened a window. The ice broke on the creek in the second week of the month. First a low groaning sound one morning before dawn, then a crack like a rifle shot, and then the sound of water moving again after 3 months of silence. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes and left the pine duff exposed and steaming. Songbirds appeared in the high branches. Not many, but enough to hear. Cora rode out with Gideon on a Tuesday morning to check the furthest sets on the trap line. The ones he'd been running on foot since the bear in February, because his ribs had taken 6 weeks to stop complaining about a horse's gait. He rode the gray Percheron now, back to full movement. Cora rode the roan pack horse, a broad-backed animal named Pepper, who had no opinions about who was on him, and was therefore ideal. She wore canvas trousers tucked into tall boots, a wool shirt, and her leather vest over it. She'd made the vest herself on a slow storm day in March, cutting the pattern from a piece of tanned elk hide, stitching the seams with waxed thread at the same tension she used on saddle panels. It fit her correctly. Across the shoulders, through the chest, at the waist. It fit what was actually there, and not what someone thought ought to be there. Her brace was under the left trouser leg, the leather dark with conditioning oil, the springs tuned twice since Gideon had first made it. She'd learned to mount and dismount without assistance 2 weeks after February. She'd learned to manage Pepper's gait on rough ground the week after that. Now she rode with her weight balanced and her hands easy on the reins and her right foot sitting in the stirrup as solidly as the left. Spring in the Wind River Range was not soft. The trails were mud, and the mud had opinions. A warm afternoon could turn to a hard freeze by midnight, and the exposed canyon walls caught wind that would knock a hat off at 20 yards. She knew all of this now. She knew which sections of the creek trail were stable, and which looked solid, but weren't. She knew which slope caught the most sun and melted first, and which stayed icy until May. She knew this place the way she knew the ledger books, precisely thoroughly because she'd paid attention. They were coming back down the main trail from the northeast sets, 4 miles from the cabin, when she heard it. Horses, more than 2. Moving up the canyon from the south at a pace that was deliberate and not hurrying but not stopping either. She looked at Gideon. He'd heard them too. He slowed the Percheron and came alongside her. 4 horses, he said. Maybe 5. Too early for freight, she said. Yes. They came around the bend in the trail where the canyon wall curved out and the southern approach opened up, and she saw them. 5 riders. 3 she didn't know. They had the look of hired men, broad and deliberate, with rifle scabbards and the straight posture of people being paid to be present. The 4th rider was Julian, thinner than she remembered, with a new hat and the same old inability to hold his own eyes steady. The 5th rider was Bertram. He looked precisely as she remembered him. Dark wool coat, good boots, the worked-at handsomeness that photographs liked. He'd had a good winter somewhere warm, clearly. He sat his horse with the ease of a man who expected to get what he'd come for. He saw her at the same time she saw him, and he stopped. Not the horse, exactly. The horse kept walking for another 4 paces before Bertram's hands came up on the reins, without him seeming to be aware of it. He stopped the animal and sat there and looked at her, and she watched the calculations move through his face. He'd come expecting a frozen corpse, or something close to it. That was the arithmetic he'd built his plan on. A woman alone in the Wyoming winter, with a bad leg, and no survival skills, and no allies, either dead or so diminished by cold and isolation that she'd sign anything to get home. Instead, he was looking at a woman on horseback, a large, healthy, clear-eyed woman in good leather, with color in her face and a straight spine and no trembling in her hands. A woman who was looking back at him with no particular expression at all. She'd practiced no expression. It wasn't performance. She simply had nothing she needed to show him. Julian's mouth had come open slightly. He shut it. Bertram nudged his horse forward. The 3 hired men spread slightly behind him as he came, a practiced widening, the arrangement of men who expected to apply pressure. Cordelia, Bertram said. He'd adjusted his voice to pleasant. Thank God. We've been searching all winter." "No," she said. "You haven't." He pulled up 10 feet from her. His eyes moved over her, over the leather vest, and the canvas trousers, and the brace at her ankle, and the way she was sitting the horse. She could see him reassembling his approach in real time. "You look well," he said, settling on something neutral. "I am well," she said. His eyes moved to Gideon. He studied him for a moment. Gideon met it without expression. "Mr. Mercer," Bertram said. Gideon said nothing. That landed, she saw it land. Bertram had expected some response to the use of his name, some acknowledgement of the arrangement between them, something he could leverage. He got silence and a steady look and nothing else. Julian was looking at his horse's ears. "Cora," Bertram said, and dropped the pleasant register entirely. "You understand the situation. Your mother's estate is in a complicated position. There are accounts that require your signature. Documents that have been waiting since November." "I know what the documents are," she said. "I know what the accounts are. I've had all winter to think about it." He paused. "Then you understand why it's important that you come back to Philadelphia," he said. "There are things that need to be settled. Your care, your future arrangements, my care," she said. "Yes. I stood on my own feet and stitched a man's wounds shut and split enough wood to heat this cabin for 4 months, she said. "What care are you referring to?" Julian looked up at that, just briefly, and then back down. Bertram's jaw shifted. He was reassessing again. She could see it. Flipping through available approaches the way a card player reorganizes his hand. "Cora." His voice dropped, went warm and careful. "Whatever's happened here, whatever you think you've built out here, you have to understand what your mother intended. Her estate was designed with your protection in mind. The trust fund is there to provide for you." "I know what the trust fund is," she said again. "I know the terms of it. I know that if I die without a legal death certificate, the shares are frozen for 7 years." She let that sit for a moment. "I also know what the notation on the bank draft said. Transport and isolation. Female subject. Heavy disabled." His face went still. She had that paper in her vest pocket. She'd carried it every day since February. She didn't pull it out now. She didn't need to. "You arranged to have me left in that canyon in January," she said. "In a blizzard. In a corset that was stopping my breathing. At an abandoned station with no shelter and no crutch and no food." "Cora, I'm not finished." Her voice was level. Quiet. It didn't shake because she didn't need it to shake. She wasn't performing anger. She was stating fact. "You arranged it because you thought I would die, and if I died without a certificate, the shares froze. And eventually you and Julian together could work through the estate lawyers to move the remaining liquid assets in ways that didn't require the frozen shares. It would take longer, but you'd calculated it was worth it." Bertram said nothing. The 3 hired men were still in their spread formation behind him. She could see the rifle scabbard on the one at the right. She kept Bertram in the center of her attention. "The calculation was wrong," she said, "because I didn't die." Gideon moved his horse slightly, not toward Bertram. Just a quarter step to the left, which changed the geometry of the group, put him at a better angle. The hired men noticed it. One of them shifted his hand. Cora looked at Julian. "Julian," she said. He finally looked at her fully. His face was complicated, guilty and defensive in equal measure. The face of a man who'd decided something was necessary and still couldn't quite get comfortable with the decision. "You knew what he was doing," she said. "You went along with it." Julian's mouth opened. "Don't," she said. "Don't tell me it was complicated. Don't tell me you had debts or pressures or that it wasn't your idea. You put your hands on my arms and you walked me to that station door and you left." She paused. "I was your sister." His mouth closed. The canyon was very quiet. Wind moved through the upper pines. Somewhere up the trail, a woodpecker was working at a dead tree, the sound sharp and repetitive and very clear in the silence. Bertram gathered himself. She could see it. He was not done. There was still the third option, the one the hired men were for. "Cora," he said. His voice had gone flat now, the pleasant register abandoned entirely. "I need you to come back with us." one way or another. No, she said. He looked at the hired man with the rifle scabbard and nodded once. Gideon said, I wouldn't. It was the first thing he'd said. He said it without heat. Just the flat certainty of a statement that didn't require argument to back it up. The hired man looked at Gideon, then at Cora, then at the terrain around them, the canyon walls, the pine cover, the two people on horseback who obviously knew this ground and obviously weren't afraid of it. He left his hand where it was. Cora reached into her vest pocket. She pulled out 2 envelopes, sealed, addressed in her own careful hand, and held them up so Bertram could see them. I mailed notarized signature verifications and a report of your murder attempt to the Philadelphia National Bank last month through the town post, she said. The color left his face. Both letters went out on the same day. In March, she said. 1 to the bank, 1 to the United States Marshal's office in Lander. She looked at him steadily. The second letter included a copy of the deposit slip, the map, and a signed statement from 2 witnesses in the town of Riverton who watched me post both envelopes and can confirm the dates. He stared at her. She put the envelopes back in her pocket. Julian was looking at his horse's ears again. He'd gone the color of old ash. Bertram sat on his horse in the mud of the April trail and looked at a woman he'd intended to disappear, and found, instead, that she was already 3 moves ahead of him. She'd been 3 moves ahead of him since March. While he'd been wherever he'd spent the winter, comfortable and certain, she'd been building toward this moment the same way she built everything now. Steadily, practically, without waste. He had nothing left to play. He pulled his horse's head around and started south. The hired men went with him without needing to be told. They were practical men. They could see which way this had gone. Julian paused. He looked at Cora one more time. His face was full of things that hadn't been said and probably wouldn't be. She looked back at him. He turned his horse and followed Bertram south down the canyon trail, and the sound of 5 horses on mud and gravel faded around the bend and then was gone. She sat on Pepper in the middle of the April trail and breathed. Gideon came alongside her. The letters were real, he said. Posted in March, she said. The same day I organized the March accounts. She'd said nothing to him about it. She'd done it methodically and quietly while he was working in the barn one morning, written both letters, sealed them, and tucked them into her coat pocket, and ridden with him to Riverton for supplies. She'd posted them while he was at the hardware store. She hadn't told him because it was her problem and her solution, and she'd wanted to solve it herself. He looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. She turned Pepper's nose toward home, and they rode north up the canyon in the April light, the creek running clear below the trail, the first green coming up through the dead grass on the south slopes, the peaks above them still white against the blue sky. The ghosts of winter were gone. She was still here. They came back the next morning. She'd expected it. Bertram was not a man who accepted the first answer as final. She'd spent enough years watching him operate in her mother's parlor to know that. He'd ride south with his hired men, and he'd sit somewhere and think, and eventually he'd decide there was still a play to make. The play he came back with was fire. She smelled it before she saw it. Just past 7 in the morning, with the coffee still on the stove, a thin thread of smoke from the south end of the barn. Not pine smoke, greenwood smoke, sharp and acrid, the smell of something set deliberately. She took the shotgun from above the door. Gideon kept it on. 2 pegs of elk antler mounted left of the door frame. A 10-gauge double barrel, cleaned and loaded every Sunday. She'd fired it 6 times over the winter, learning on targets nailed to the far tree line. She was not skilled. She was functional, which was different and more honest. She knew the spread pattern at 20 yards, the recoil against her shoulder, and where to aim for effect at close range. She went out the back door. The smoke was coming from where she'd thought, the south end of the barn, where dry hay was stacked closest to the outer wall. She could see the low flicker of flame at the base of the boards through a gap in the planking. Recent. It hadn't caught the hay yet. She moved around the east side of the cabin. They were in the trees. 3 hired men and Bertram. Julian was not with them this time, which told her something. Even Julian had a limit somewhere. Bertram had positioned himself at the edge of the tree line, perhaps 50 feet from the cabin, with 2 hired men flanking him. The third was behind the barn, currently trying to build a fire that the morning damp was fighting. He saw her come around the corner with the shotgun. "Cora," he said, "put that down. You're burning my barn," she said. "I'm making a point," he said. "Sign the transfer papers, and I'll have him put it out." She looked at the 2 men flanking him. The one on the left had his hand near his pistol. The one on the right held a coil of rope. The rope was for Gideon. She looked at the left man's hand, then at the angle, then at the ground between them. She'd spent 4 months learning this terrain in every weather and every light. She knew every root and rock and dip. She knew where the ground fell away behind the large ponderosa 20 feet to her left. She knew the sight lines from every point in the yard. She took 4 steps left to the base of that ponderosa, which put the trunk between her and Bertram, and opened a clear angle on the left gunman's position. "Last chance," Bertram said. "Sign the papers." "I already told you," she said. "I mailed notarized signature verifications and a report of your murder attempt to the Philadelphia National Bank last month through the town post." He stared at her. "There's nothing left to sign," she said. "The bank knows I'm alive. The marshal's office knows what you did. The papers are already received in Philadelphia. Burning this barn doesn't change what's already sitting on a banker's desk." Behind her, she heard Gideon come out the front of the cabin. He'd gone for his rifle when she'd gone for the shotgun. She hadn't needed to tell him. She'd heard him move the moment she'd lifted the 10-gauge off the wall. Bertram's eyes moved from her to Gideon and back. "Your play is finished," she told him. "There's nothing left here for you." The left gunman made a decision. She saw his shoulder move before his hand did. She'd been watching his shoulder the whole time. She stepped out from the ponderosa and fired the right barrel at the ground 6 feet in front of him. The blast threw dirt and pine needles and caught the near edge of his boot, and he stumbled backward with a shout. His pistol hit the ground. She moved fast across the 20 feet between them, and by the time he found his balance, she had the left barrel pointed at his chest from 4 feet away. He put both hands up. The yard went very quiet. Gideon had the rifle on the second man. The rope hit the ground without ceremony. Behind the barn, the third man put out his own fire. She heard boots on smoking wood, and then nothing. Bertram stood in the tree line with no flanking, no fire, no rope, no play, and looked at her. He was looking for the thing he'd always looked for when he looked at her. The shame. The apologetic folding. The collapse that came from years of being told she caused too much trouble and took up too much space. It wasn't there. He looked at the shotgun. He looked at the terrain, the cabin and the barn and the canyon wall, the full landscape of a place she knew completely, and he didn't know at all. He turned his horse. His men came to him without being called. They were practical men, and they could see which way this had gone. All 4 rode south, and she stood in the pine woods with the 10-gauge broken over her arm and watched them until the hoofbeats were gone. She walked to the barn and checked the base of the south wall. Scorched boards. Some charring at the lowest course, nothing that hadn't been stopped in time. She got a bucket from the creek and put the last of it out properly. Gideon came around the corner and looked at the wall. Then at her. "The left man's pistol is in the pine needles about 10 yards east," she said. He went and found it and brought it back. She looked at the shotgun in her hands. "I aimed at the ground," she said. "Not at him, I know," Gideon said. "I didn't want to hurt anyone, I know that too." She handed him the gun to reload and walked back to the cabin to finish her coffee. The marshal arrived 6 days later. His name was Calvin Birch. He rode in from Lander with 2 deputies and a set of federal warrants folded in his breast pocket, and the unhurried manner of a man who'd done this kind of work long enough to know it was mostly paperwork and patience. He was 50, raw-boned, with a gray mustache and eyes that cataloged a scene quickly. He found Bertram and his men at the Riverton boarding house, where they'd apparently been since the morning of the barn incident, sitting on an uncertain decision about which direction to move. Julian was with them. They went without significant resistance. Julian was the first one out the door. She heard later. She gave her statement at the cabin table, with the two original pages from Bertram's coat spread flat between her and Marshall Birch, the deposit slip, the map. She spoke for an hour. He wrote everything down in a narrow, careful hand, stopping her twice to clarify dates. At the end of it, he looked at the papers and her signed account and said, "Miss Vance, this is one of the most complete cases I've received in 20 years. I had a long winter," she said. He folded everything back into his case and shook her hand and rode south. 2 weeks after that, a letter arrived from the First Commercial Bank of Philadelphia, then a second from the estate lawyers, then a third from an independent trustee the bank had appointed to manage the transition. She read all three at the table, with her morning coffee, and made notes in the margins, and wrote her responses that same evening. The fortune was larger than she'd fully understood. Her mother had been a careful investor, and the trust had compounded for 12 years. The liquid assets alone were substantial. The bank shares were worth more than the original appraisers had ever estimated. She sat with the numbers for 2 days. Then she wrote 4 letters. One to the bank, one to a land attorney in Lander, one to a medical supply manufacturer in St. Louis she'd found listed in one of Gideon's old trade catalogs, one to the Territorial Land Office. She read them to Gideon at breakfast. He listened without interrupting. 50% to the fund, she said. The Vance Mobility and Self-Esteem Fund. Custom braces, wheelchairs, trade training. For disabled and plus-size individuals in Wyoming who can't pay for it themselves. He looked at her across the table. "It should have existed already," she said. "It didn't, so I'm going to build it." She set that letter down and picked up the next. "The land parcel at the south end of the canyon. The flat section with creek access," she said. "I'm buying it." "What for?" he said. "The workshop," she said. "A proper building. Wide doors, wide aisles, equipment that fits actual bodies. A saddlery side and an orthotic side. Mercer Vance Saddlery and Orthotic Workshop." He was quiet for a moment. "You included my name," he said. "You built the first brace," she said. "The leather press is yours. And I'm going to need someone who actually knows how to work hide and metal." She set the letter down. "I'll run the books and handle the orthotic design. You run the saddlery. We split the operation down the middle." He looked out the window. The Maylight was coming in strong across the workbench, lighting up the tools on the beams and the sorted jars and the measuring tape on its hook. "All right," he said. They broke ground on the workshop in May. She hired 3 men from Riverton and oversaw the construction herself, specifying door widths and threshold heights and window placement for working light. The floor was planed pine over solid subfloor, smooth enough for a wheelchair to roll across without catching on anything. The first brace she made at the new bench was for a 12-year-old girl named Ruth, the daughter of a ranch family east of Riverton, a foot condition similar to Cora's, less severe, caught earlier. 2 doctors had told the family to keep the girl off it and wait. Cora measured Ruth's leg herself with the leather tape, making notes on brown paper. Ruth watched her the whole time, looking at Cora's brace, at the way she moved, at the way she stood with her full weight on both feet and worked without pausing to apologize for any part of herself. "Does it hurt?" Ruth said. "The brace," Cora said. "No, it was made right." She finished the measurements and wrote up the pattern and started cutting that same afternoon. The fund's first year covered 11 braces, 2 wheelchairs refitted with wider seats, and 3 trade apprenticeships for young men in the valley who'd lost limbs in ranch accidents and been told they had no working future. She managed every account in the second ledger, separate from the workshop books, in the same double-entry system she'd set up in February in Gideon's cabin on a storm night with a charcoal stick. She checked both ledgers every Sunday morning with her coffee. The numbers were clean. The work was real. That was enough. The wedding was in July, no church. There wasn't one close enough to matter, and neither of them wanted to wait for it. Anyway, the ceremony took place in the open yard in front of the new workshop building on a Saturday morning when the canyon was full green and the creek was running high and the peaks to the north still wore their last white against a sky that was completely, perfectly blue. She made the dress herself, not every stitch of it. She cut the pattern and did the fitted work, and brought in a seamstress from Riverton named Clara to help with the volume of the skirt, which was full and sweeping, cut from cream-colored wool that draped without pulling. The bodice was structured but not tight. She'd built the boning herself from the same flexible steel she used in braces now, curved to her actual torso and her actual ribs. It held her upright and supported her without compressing. She could take a full breath from the bottom of her lungs all the way to the top. She embroidered the cuffs herself. Small leather flowers in dark thread, a pattern she'd worked out on brown paper over 3 evenings. The hem was hemmed short enough to show the brace. She hadn't debated it. The brace was part of her, and it was beautiful. The dark conditioned bull hide and the shaped steel springs, the top edge sitting just below the knee where the dress hem cleared it. Clara had asked twice whether she wanted the hem let down. Cora had said no twice, and Clara had nodded and moved on. Gideon was standing at the far end of the yard when she came out of the cabin. He wore a black coat, new, bought from the Riverton dry goods store, and altered at the shoulders because he didn't fit the standard cut. His shirt was white. He'd shaved that morning. He looked exactly like himself. The canyon and the years in the weather still visible in the lines of his face, and he was looking at her with the full direct regard she'd come to know as the way he was when he meant something completely. The witnesses were Marshall Birch, who happened to be back in the valley on unrelated business and had accepted the invitation with visible pleasure, and Clara and the ranch family whose daughter Ruth now walked to school on Mondays with a bullhide brace on her right leg. The justice of the peace read the necessary words. She walked down the strip of firm ground between 2 rows of pine chairs Gideon had built and set out that morning. She walked on her own. The brace was solid under her, and the ground was dry, and the sun was warm at her back, and she walked the full length without a hand on anything. She reached him. He took her hands, and she felt the calluses on his palms against the calluses on hers, the mark of the same kind of work done in the same space. And he looked at her with everything she'd learned to read in that face. Pride, steadiness, the particular piece of a man who had exactly what he wanted and knew it. The justice read the words. They said yes. He held her face in both hands and kissed her once firmly, and the small crowd of 5 people made enough noise for 50. They ate lunch at the long table outside the workshop. Ruth sat at the end and ate 3 pieces of cornbread and talked at length about a horse she intended to break before summer ended, and nobody suggested she couldn't. In the afternoon, Cora went into the workshop alone for a little while. She stood at her bench and looked at the tools laid out in order. The measuring tape on its peg, the curved needles in their holder, the charcoal sticks in the clay jar, the half-finished brace for a boy in town who'd had his ankle set wrong after a December fall. She picked up the tape and held it in both hands. She thought about the tin pail in the abandoned station at Deadwood Ridge, about the folding knife in her pocket, about the corset in the snow and the first full breath of January air, and what it had felt like to stop contracting herself into a shape built for someone else's convenience. She thought about Gideon's cabin, the workbench, and the ledger books, and the fire steady in the stone fireplace, the stool he'd built in an afternoon because the chair had broken and she'd asked to be thrown into the snow, the brace he'd made from measurements taken from her actual leg and not the imagined one. She thought about Ruth walking to school on Mondays. The window faced north, up the canyon toward the peaks. She could see two of them from where she stood, massive and white-capped, and entirely indifferent to the size of the people at their feet. The canyon did not care what you weighed. The peaks did not adjust their difficulty based on what anyone thought of your body. The creek ran the same. For everyone, and the winter was equal in its cold, and the spring came back without being asked. You just had to stay. Gideon appeared in the workshop doorway. "People are asking where you went," he said. "I was just looking," she said. He came in and stood beside her at the window, and his hand found hers at the edge of the bench and held it without making anything of it. She looked at the peaks one last time. Then she turned toward the door and the table, and the sound of voices outside in the July sun. You never had to shrink yourself to fit a world that wasn't built for you. When you learned to stand tall and love who you were, you found someone who treasured every part of you. She walked out into the light, both feet, her own pace, all the way. Cordelia Vance walked into that Wyoming winter with nothing but a folding knife her father left her and a body that the world had spent 22 years telling her was wrong. She walked out of it with calloused hands, a bullhide brace she helped design, a workshop with her name above the door, and a man standing at the end of an aisle who looked at every part of her and didn't flinch once. But here's what I want you to sit with for a moment before you go. Cora didn't change to be loved. She didn't shrink herself, starve herself, or apologize herself into someone else's idea of acceptable. She picked up an axe and learned where to aim it. She picked up a needle and learned how tight to pull the thread. She picked up a ledger and reorganized 12 months of accounts in one night by a fire in a one-room cabin in the middle of a blizzard. She was the same woman the whole time. The world around her just finally caught up to what she actually. That's not a fantasy. That's a choice, a hard one made over and over. Every morning you decide to keep going, instead of contracting yourself to fit a space someone else measured for you. Gideon saw her clearly from the first night. Not because he was perfect, he wasn't. He took a job he shouldn't have taken. He kept a secret he should have told. But when he got there and saw what was actually happening, he turned around. He went back, and then he spent 3 months building things: a stool, a brace, a trust that fit the real woman and not the imagined one. The lesson in that is simple and worth keeping. Judge people by the full length of what they do, not just the worst moment you can find. The canyon didn't care what Cora weighed. The winter was equal in its cold. The peaks didn't adjust themselves based on anyone's opinion of her body. That's the wilderness telling you the truth that polite society has been getting wrong for centuries. Your worth was never in your measurements. It was always in what you're willing to do when there's no one watching and no one coming. Cora figured that out on a tin pail in a blizzard. You don't have to wait that long. Stand up. Take up the space you were always supposed to have. Do the work in front of you. That's the whole story. This story is a work of historical fiction created for entertainment and inspirational purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental.